Our scripture today is found in the book of Romans. As I said, we're going to be in Romans for quite a while. We're still in Romans chapter 1. And today we're going to be looking at verses 18 through 32. So we'll finish up chapter 1 today. Remember last week we talked about not being ashamed of the gospel and how the gospel is the revelation of the righteousness of God. The gospel is what we call a specific revelation. There are two types of revelation found in the Bible that the Bible talks about. There's specific revelation where God has come down and God has given us a direct word to tell us something very specific about Him. And then there's general revelation. And general revelation is where it's just God kind of revealing Himself in general, through general means, and our passage today kind of talks about that general revelation. We read for our call to worship Psalm 19, where it talks about the heavens declaring the glory of the Lord. You know, that's general revelation. You know, we can look out at the stars at the night and go, you know, somebody had to have designed this. This is not an accident. You don't get these spirals on accident. I've blown a lot of things up in my life, and you don't get those spirals, right? It's just a mess when you blow things up. So let's look at Romans 1, chapter 18, verse 18, all the way to the end of Romans. And I will say, this is a hard section for a lot of us. So, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanliness, in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteousness or righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Paul could be writing that about America today. I think this is one of the hard things. He could be writing that about people today, where we talk about, well, we've evolved, we've become smarter. The reality is, as people, quote unquote, evolve, we just find new ways of saying, God, we don't want you. God, get out of here, we don't need you. Right? And that's what he's saying. They became foolish as they thought they were becoming wise. But there are several things in this passage for us to look at. And the first is that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. When we lived in West Edmiston, our neighbor across the street, he was a Eastern Orthodox, and I loved him. He was a godly man, and we often would have this debate about the wrath of God. And he said, well, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, we don't believe in the wrath of God. It's just the love of God. Right? And I said, okay. He said, and it's just that if you don't accept Christ and if you don't follow him, you aren't prepared to accept that love. Okay. And then I come back and say, but what do you do with the Bible passages that say the wrath of God? Right? So there is a wrath of God. Right? And the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Right? Something inside us knows, because heaven declares it, something inside us knows that God is going to judge us one day. That one day we are going to have to answer for the things we've done wrong. Yesterday, as I was finalizing some stuff about the message, I was telling Sarah that my illustration for this, it's that moment. And I think all of us have had this moment with a child at one point. Is Nick here? Nick might not have because he's younger, right? But the rest of us, we've had this moment where you're dealing with a child and you look at the child and you say, don't do that. And the child looks at you and they look you in the eye, and as they're looking you in the eye, they start doing whatever you've told them, you don't do that. And I don't know a single person who doesn't have inside of them something that spikes up and goes, what are you doing? Right? In your head, you may have that moment where you're like, wait, this is just a child. Relax. They're a child. They're stupid. It's okay. We can get through this. But that initial reaction is, what are you doing? You stop that. The wrath is inspired, right? Because they know that what they're doing is wrong. And it doesn't mean you love the child any less. It doesn't mean, you know what? I mean, all three of my children, they've done this. Every child I've worked with at one point has done this, right? Doesn't mean we love them any less. Well, the reality is that this whole passage is saying we've done that very thing to God. We are the children, looking God in the eye, going, yes, you told me not to do this. I'm doing it anyway. And so God has a wrath. And God says, look, there is no excuse. Right? Because you know that the wrath is there. You know it's coming. You know. In our house, we're told you never threaten your children. Somebody told me that once, and I said, I never threaten my children. I promise them. If you do that, this is going to be the consequence. Right? And if they do that, the consequence always comes. See, a threat would be, if you do that, this is going to happen, and then it's something that I can't carry through. No, if you do that, you're getting a spanking. They do it, they get a spanking. Right? We know there's a consequence to disobeying God. It says the heavens declare it. And it doesn't just declare it, but it declares it against all ungodliness, against all unrighteousness of men. That indicates that all the sins we do, somewhere deep inside, we know it's wrong. We know that we shouldn't be taking the cookie when we are told not to take the cookie. We know that we shouldn't be telling lies. We tell it to our children all the time, and then we go out and, no wonder our children lied to us, because we lie. We know it's wrong. And so, He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." Right? So this is what we do. We take our sin and we go, "Nope, that's not a sin," and we suppress it. Even though we know it's a sin. And we try to cover it up, and we try to excuse it. We try to reason it out why, okay, it's okay to do this sin. We read in my class this week, we read The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. In it, the man, there are two guys, Fortunato and Montresor. Montresor is insulted by Fortunato, and so he devises a plan, and he takes Fortunato into his catacombs to give him some wine from this cask of Amontillado. And as they're walking along, he's getting Fortunato drunk, and they get to the end of the catacombs, and there's a hole dug in the wall and some chains in there, and he chains Fortunato up, and he builds up the wall, and he walks away, and the end of the poem is, "And it hasn't been touched for half a century." Right, so he kills Fortunato. And so I ask my students, is Montresor a good guy or a bad guy? Because they've figured out he's the main character, he's the protagonist. Oh, he's a good guy. You're telling me that this guy who kills another man because he was insulted is a good guy? Yeah. And they start explaining away why it's okay to kill somebody for insulting your family name. Right? And that's an extreme. We can all go, "Oh, that's bad." Right? And I'm a little afraid of my students now, right? Because they think it's okay to kill me, right? If I insult them in any way or shape or form. But the reality is, we do that with our sin. We do that to lesser extents, maybe not to that extreme, but we find ways of arguing that my sin is okay. And Paul says, no, that's suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And he said, look, we know you know it, because with what may be known of God is manifest in you. It's manifest in people. Because God has shown it to us. And it says, for since the creation of the world, in nature itself, his attributes are clearly seen. Those invisible things, those characteristics, we know that God is a God of order. God is a God of peace. God is a God of love. We know that because it's in nature. And it's interesting, as we look at that, you go to any culture in the world, there are some fundamentals that they go, yeah, that's wrong. Right? So every culture in the world, murdering people is wrong. Murdering people within your own tribe is wrong, I should say. Lying is wrong. Stealing is wrong. There are universals that we know are wrong. You know, it's not because each of these cultures were very smart and said, hey, no, it's just something in nature says this is wrong. You see, sin is actually visible because we know it, because God has made it manifest. And he's made his own power and his own Godhead manifest. And not only do we deny the sin, but we come to a point where we start denying that God exists. In little ways, we start chipping away at that idea that God exists. Right? We live in a time where people are saying, well, you have to be an idiot to believe in a God. Right? You have to be stupid to believe in a God. You have to have a very low intelligence. Right? Because, after all, we've studied science enough to know that science created the world. I think it was gravity. That's Stephen Hawking's argument, right? Gravity made everything come into existence. At least that's what I'm told by a former chemistry teacher. That's what Stephen Hawking claims, is gravity made everything come into existence. Well, wait a minute, where did the law of gravity come from, right? You see, laws don't just make themselves. Somebody had to have planned them. Somebody had to have organized it. And gravity doesn't make anything. It just pulls things together. And so if there's nothing to pull together, gravity doesn't have any effect. Right? So something had to make this stuff, right? We can reason through that. And it turns out that actually Some of the higher up scientists, those guys with PhDs, I actually have quite a few friends. It's really weird. I have a lot of scientific friends with PhDs in chemistry and biology. It turns out that they say the more they study, the more they are convinced there's no way you could possibly be a reasonable human being and not believe in a God. Right? But we're told we must be stupid because we believe in God. But really, when you study nature, we find that no, God is God. God is real. God exists. You can't explain science without God, eventually. We get to that point where no, God had to have created it. We talk about the Big Bang, and I say, you know what, I have proof of the Big Bang. It says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? He said, let there be light, and there was light. There's a Big Bang right there. God spoke. But no, we are so busy pushing God away, finding ways of explaining things without God, trying to find ways of making it so that God has no authority. Because the reality is, if there is no God, then I don't have to answer for my sins. Right? If there is no God, there's no wrath of God. If there is no God, well, we realize if there is no God, there is nothing in creation. Because He created all things. The heavens declare His glory. And so people say, hey, we're wiser than that. We're enlightened. We've grown beyond that. But no, that's foolishness. And in doing that, they try to make God into the image of man. Well, God must be like us. And I used the New King James when I read it from you guys, mostly because I know in the NIV, verse 23 there says, and they changed the glory of the immortal God into the image of mortal man, right? And the term corruptible is a little bit better. See, God is incorruptible. It's not just that He's immortal, but He's incorruptible. What God does, God is just in doing. God does not fall prey to sin. God does not fall prey to injustice. God is incorruptible. He cannot be less than perfect. Where you and I, we are corruptible man. And it turns out that you and I, well, we're imperfect. I was thinking during Jen's children's message, and I agree, I don't like to hear children talk like that either. But there are imperfections in us that we like to fix. I overeat. Yesterday we were at my parents' house, and we drink soda at their house. I shouldn't drink soda, I know it. Right? That's an imperfection I need to work on. Right? I have friends who, they constantly lie. It's an imperfection that they need to work on. We have other friends with other sins that they know they need to work on because we're corruptible. And we get corrupted. My father right now, he's actually preaching at his church about government. He's preaching out of Peter. And one of his points is, as long as men run governments, it's going to have some sense of corruption. Because it turns out that we as people, we're corrupted. We're corruptible and we are imperfect. But yet we try to make God like us. And we limit Him. Well, if God had really meant this, He would have done this, right? Instead of going, you know what, God said it, I'm going to believe it, that's what I'm going to do. Right? Well, if God really didn't want me to lie, He wouldn't make it so easy to lie. Or He wouldn't let me be in situations where lying was the only way out. Well, it turns out lying's never the only way out. We just don't like the alternatives all the time. And yeah, I pick on lying a lot because I feel lying's real easy to pick on. And because most of us aren't going to go out and kill somebody. So picking on murder is it's somewhat irrelevant. And so we try to make God like us so that we can make it so that, oh no, God made a mistake here. Oh, when God said that, He didn't know. Right? And it says, because we do this, because we try to separate ourselves from God, because we try to suppress what is sin, and we try to take that truth and say, nope, it's not there. Because we try to say, hey, guess what? There's no wrath of God. God's just love. And so therefore everybody goes to heaven. That's a Unitarian kind of viewpoint. Universalist, not Unitarian. Yeah, anyway. Because of that, we make these lies. Because of that, it says, therefore God gave them over to it. God allowed us to go into our sin because we rejected him. We can say, well, God, you let me do it. You know what? I look at my children and I say, don't do this. And you know what? I don't go over there and grab their arms and stop them from doing it. I look at them and I say, don't do this. And then they do it because I let them. And then they face the consequences. Right? And God said, look, if that's what you want to do, go ahead. See how it works out. See how it works out. And in this passage, there is a lengthy section about how unnatural sin really is. And Paul uses initially he uses the sin of homosexuality. The act of sleeping with somebody of the same sex as you. Right? He uses that to point out that sin is unnatural. And it's easy for us to get bogged down and to concentrate onto that sin, but he has a long list that he comes up with after that. And it really turns out that all sin is actually unnatural. It's easy, but it's unnatural. And so he says, look, there's no excuse for our sin. We know it's wrong. And as he gives that list, my personal favorite sin in that list is because we're going through things like sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. Right? He's got these lists of, these are really bad things, and he gets disobedient to parents. We don't think of that one as a really bad thing. But you know, it's once you get to that one, you can go, you know what, I don't really backbite. I don't really hate God. I'm not violent. I'm not proud. I don't really boast about anything. I try not to do evil things. I'm not sexually immoral. Oh man, I disobeyed my parents at one point in life. I'm in that list. Every one of us is in that list. Every one of us. And that's the point here. That's the point, is that we all sin. And sin is in opposition to God. It is so foreign to God. It is unnatural. Yet we find excuses for it. We find reasons to do it. And he finishes up this section. Knowing the righteous judgments of God. Again, we know. And we know that there's a penalty for it. That those who practice such things are deserving of death. Not only do the same, but we also approve of those who practice them. And he's writing this to the church at Rome. Well, at the time he's writing this, Rome is actually promoting amongst their military that they would find sexual partners amongst the soldiers. Because they believe that, hey, if you have this love for this person, you'll fight harder with them by your side to keep them alive. You'll fight against the enemy harder. Right? Well, we have a way of approving of sin. A way of not just approving it, but we promote it. And we practice it. And we teach it. And that ought not to be the case. That ought not to be the case. We're without excuse. We know it's wrong. We know it's wrong. But it is easy. And for a season, sin feels good. But it has earned us the wrath of God. In one passage, it talks about the wrath of God being poured out upon us, upon all unrighteousness. Just like this passage is talking about how it is revealed against us. And the reality is that this is why we need the gospel. This is why the world needs the gospel. Yet, this is a hard message. Sin is hard. Facing sin is hard. Stopping sin is hard. But the reality is that the forgiveness of sin, that also was hard. But for us to accept it should be easy. The forgiveness of sin came through Jesus Christ, where the wrath of God was poured out upon his Son, where he took that burden on the cross. And so when we deny sin, when we deny that the things that we know to be wrong are wrong, we're insulting the cross. We're denying the pain that Christ had to go through. And it's not just the pain of dying, but it was the pain of all of our sin being poured out upon him. It was the pain of the wrath of God being poured out upon him. The separation from the Father. And so let us not deny Christ. Let us not deny what we know to be true. Let us accept that sin is sin. Let us confront it, and let us share Jesus Christ, the answer to it. Will you bow with me in prayer?